Hello, this is the Stephen Owl, and we're here with a very special video today. Now, we're going to do a sort of special two-parter top 10 video. This will be the first half, and then there'll be the second half. Right now, we are looking at top 5 overlooked comic book movies. Now, for me, I already did a while back my top 10 comic book films of all time. However, after that, I realized I wanted to do overlooked or underrated. But I realized when doing it, overlooked and underrated are kind of the same thing to me. So because of that, when I was doing the list, I decided, well, I'm going to do overlooked as its own top 5 and underrated as its own top 5, and that will be kind of the top 10 video I'll be working on. Now, what are the criteria for an overlooked and an underrated? Well, for me, an overlooked has to be a film that is an absolute classic, or at least very well critically liked by most audiences and critics, but are overlooked because they're not part of, say, DC or Marvel. They fly under the radar. Overrated are films that, don't get the respect or the recognition I feel they do deserve. So with that kind of definition out of the way, let's get into the list, or in this case, my top 5. And kicking off at number 5, we've got, coming in at number 5 on this list, is The Mask. Now, people don't know that this film is actually based off a comic book, but it is. But however, the film and the comic book are drastically different in regards of tone and even style. The comic book is really dark, known for its super violence and just being essentially over the top. And essentially, over-the-top violence, kind of like Deadpool. The Mask plays it more as homage to Looney Tunes silliness. The premise of the film is a guy named Stanley Ipkiss, a meek bank employee, who after one day stumbles upon a magical green mask, magical, wooden mask. He turns into the character of, the Mask. And basically is a superhero that can bend reality and basically just goes completely off the rails comedy. That's essentially the film. The character Stanley Ipkiss is portrayed, of course, by the always talented Jim Carrey. And this film is synonymous with Jim Carrey in the same vein that Pirates of the Caribbean is synonymous with Johnny Depp as Jack Sparrow. Now, for me, I put this as a comic book film because it is based off a comic book, and it is a really fun, entertainable ride. But people don't talk about it as a comic book film. They talk about it really more as a Jim Carrey film, and more of his filmography, and not really it being a part of comic books. But I like it for that fact. For me, it does subvert a lot of expectations. The meek nerd, turns into a superhero, but the superhero is more of a kind of ambiguous, doing what he wants, and it's clear that Stanley Ipkiss has little to absolutely no control every time he puts on the mask. The female leads subvert expectations with stereotypes. If I could really say there's a real fault with this film, it might kind of be with the villain, who is basically just a gangster tough guy. Peter Green plays the character of Dorian Terrell, who is generally good in the role, and when he gets put on the mask, I was expecting him to come more villainous, but instead, it falls flat. The comedy, is absolutely just outrageous in this film, and again, it works because of Jim Carrey's over-the-top zany performance. And I'm pretty sure you can see this film, it's easy to get your hands on, but I put it at number 5 because, again, there's just more I want to talk about, but for me, this is a film that generally needs to be talked about more comic book circles than it, usually does, because it usually never is. Anyway, that's number 5. Coming in at number 4. Number 4, The Mask of Zorro, released in 1998. Now, Zorro is a beloved and very unique superhero of his own right. First off, he didn't start off as a comic book character. That really came later down the line. And eventually when he did, he got drafted later, but he's not really that much of a presence in comic books, but he is very much a medium, mostly because he has inspired so many superheroes, and being partially one of the biggest influences on Batman, to the point where they reference that the movie that Bruce Wayne saw the night his parents got killed was a Zorro film. This film is a great swashbuckling adventure that kind of that does, for me, further explore a lot of the main character. The film here, we follow an old aged original, Zorro, Don Dalihan, Don Dalla Vega, who sets out to essentially avenge his murdered wife and find his daughter who's been kidnapped by the main villain. But while he does, he stumbles across a young aide who becomes the successor to the Zorro mantle, Alejandro, and both essentially set out to prove that Zorro is back, and essentially to, achieve their own desired ends. Now, first off, the old Zorro in the film, is portrayed by Anthony Hopkins, who was perfect for this type of role. But the scene stealer, of course, is Antonio Banderas as the younger Zorro. In fact, when you think of Zorro, for me, there's two actors that, for me, honestly encapsulate the role. One is Guy Williams from the Disney TV show in the 1950s, and of course, Antonio Banderas in this film and its sequel. But I'm only counting the first one because this is just a great film. I love how we are set in a different time period. We're set really in very foreign territory. We are set in like a more, I guess, Spanish, Mexico type area. And for me, this is a fun swashbuckling adventure. I like how there's a lot of practical stunt coordination, absolute great sword fights, and a very intriguing and interesting story to go along with it. Honestly, this film is an absolute, roller coaster ride. Now, why I put it above the fifth one? Well, first off, this one is definitely not as talked about as the Mask. But for me, this film is just a breath of fresh air of, because we're not following the same format of traditional superheroes. We're going further back. There is a sort of subtle theme of young versus old, the mentor and the apprentice, something we rarely get in superhero films, where the older superhero is passing down to the younger generation. That's something I've rarely had experience with. This is probably the first time it is, and probably might be the last time, unless, I don't know, they plan to do on the Batman Robin bringing on the mantle, but it doesn't look like at this point. Overall, The Mask of Zorro is an absolutely great example of a swashbuckling film and proof that superheroes can be good in a swashbuckler setting. Anyway, number 3, Watchmen, released in 2009, directed by Zack Snyder. Zack Snyder gets a bit of criticisms, a little bit, by a lot of film goers, especially like he was in the DCEU, but now I think he's regained a bit more favor. Watchmen is a series that now is part of DC, or is now owned by DC, but I don't think it ever was when it first started out. Basically, Watchmen is like a more anthology type series with basically superheroes from different eras, but the main plot point in this is the hero, a vigilante known as Rorschach, the character that you see in the fedora in front of you, and basically he sets out to investigate the mysterious circumstances of one of his, the death of one of his previous colleagues, which of course is the Comedian, another form of superhero, but more of an anti-hero type. Now this feels so like a political type superhero film ish, and it can be a hit or miss. The cinematography, the pacing for me works incredibly well, and it has a lot of many standout characters. Dr. Manhattan, Owlman, the Comedian. Night Owl, not Owlman, Night Owl. The Silk Spectre, Ozymandias. But for me, the biggest, the quintessential greatest character from this film is always going to be Rorschach. There's something about the design of the character, the trench coat, the fedora, the mask he wears. It's just, this film has a lot of political points, and it's just different. It could really, it doesn't end like a traditional superhero film would. It ends in the complete opposite direction, which I appreciate that they went in that route. Overall, this film is definitely a passion project from Zack Snyder, and honestly, it's a really fun, enjoyable experience. with a very unique plot. Well, not really so much unique, but a different beat by beat that is rarely done in superhero films, and I love it because of those factors. And I highly recommend giving this one a watch, because honestly, this is proof, at least in my view, that Zack Snyder can really make a good superhero film, and especially adapting a product that is rare, that is not owned by DC or Marvel, and done very successfully. And that's why I think you should give it a watch. Give it a watch. This is a really good one. Number two. Number 2 goes to Sin City. Sin City is, of course, one of the greatest, I guess, one of the most darkest comic book films probably ever adapted. Again, the number 3, Watchmen, and Sin City are probably the prime examples of having dark superhero films. Take it seriously. Sin City is, of course, is a part of the many back catalogs from Frank Miller. And he partly directed this along with Robert Rodriguez, probably butchering his last name. And basically, the whole film is basically 4 individuals cross paths when they try to solve their personal problems and fight violence in a corruption in the wretched town of Basin City. Basically, I just love how this film is not afraid to be a comic book film. The color palettes, the fact that it's dark and grey. And in fact, a lot of the characters here are dark and grey, and you don't really get that. It had a sequel, which is alright, but honestly, this is just spectacular in its own right. I just love how, you like, it's a black and white noir comic book film, a neo-noir crime film, that is basically a graphic novel. And honestly, I just love how it does have some slightly silly moments, but it takes itself seriously, and it's not ashamed to be violent as it wants to be. And honestly, this film definitely deserves its praise for essentially the technical groundbreaking it was with the special effects, and definitely the cinematography. The main at least the first character we follow, Marv, who is this former cop, badly bruised, whatever you want. He's just he's like a brick wall that is constantly going after you, and nothing you do will put him down. This is definitely, just like Watchmen, a different film experience. And the fact that they are greatest examples of how dark you can bring a superhero film but still make it entertainable to an audience is generally, is brilliant. The fact that they managed to pull that off. And honestly, this is probably the best adaptation of Frank Miller's work. Now, I don't know that much about Frank Miller, much of his work, other than this, but I best know his work, of course, in The Dark Knight Returns, and of course, Batman Year One. But this is just groundbreaking. This is dripping in atmosphere and just darkness. And I would have almost put this at number 1, but I think 1 just beats it. And number 1 is The Crow. Okay, people said this is not overlooked. Well, for me, it kind of is. The Crow is groundbreaking as it's considered the first proper dark superhero film. And I mean really dark. It goes all the way. More so than Tim Burton's Batman ever did. This one goes all the way. Based on the character of the same name. Again, another character not owned by, DC or Marvel. The Crow, we follow the story of Eric Draven, who, after, is basically beaten and killed along with his fiancée or wife on Devil's Night. He is then resurrected from the grave to avenge the death of his loved ones, and that's basically the premise. But what I love about it, what I really love about it, is the really dark theme here of loss, of tragedy, of life and death. And when we think of this film, the thing that always pops to mind is the fantastic performance given to us by Brandon Lee, who plays Eric Draven, the Crow. He is just so groundbreaking. And that name should ring a bell? Well, it should. Because he is related to Bruce Lee. And of course, we've already talked about Bruce Lee on this channel, as he played Kato in the original 1960s Green Hornet series. So both Brandon Lee and his father play iconic superheroes. Unfortunately, we of course know the tragedy around this film, that the hardcore guys know. Brandon Lee died on set, and there are some scenes where they had to have stunt doubles in to fill it. But, you know, even with that, if he had lived, he would have had a successful film career, because this is what started it all. This started it all. And I agree, this is a great film. It is so dark, but it's also a film I could really only watch once a year, especially around the Halloween season, because it's such dark themes. It's not like I could say The Mask, when it pops up, I'm constantly going to watch, or the Zorro the same way. The Crow is a film I can really only watch once a year, and even when I do watch it once a year, I am never disappointed. It is a tragedy what happened to Brandon Lee, and with that said, he gave us, just like Heath Ledger did with the Joker, his final film performance is arguably his greatest film performance, not just he's given in his career, but arguably has given to cinema. So, to Brandon Lee, may you rest in peace, and thank you for this fantastic film performance. And there we have it. Those were my top 5 overlooked comic book films. Do you agree with this list? Do you have films that are really overlooked? Please write down in the comments. I plan to do the top 5 underrated films. I definitely know I'm going to get some backlash around that one, because some of these topics are going to be like, really? But hopefully you'll hear them out. Also understand, for me, these are films the list I just did, these are films I considered overlooked. Why? Because I just don't hear them being talked as much. You're probably going to go up on the list and say, well, we hear The Crow. Yeah, maybe, but for me, I don't hear it as much. In fact, I don't hear it barely at all, even around Halloween, which is ironic, because I'm always hearing people dress up as The Crow around Halloween, yet I don't see it. I don't hear of it. So anyway, please, write down in the comments your 5 overlooked. Remember what my criteria are for an overlooked? Films that are well received, but just aren't talked about as much with the new mainstream comic book films. Anyway, but stick around for the second part of this, as we would do my top 5 underrated ones. And I definitely am excited for that list, because I've got some very unique choices. But until then, this has been the Steven Hour, and so long for now, and please enjoy the rest of your day.